So, Hebrews 12, verses 1 to 17, we'll read together here. Therefore, which picks up the story from Hebrews 11, the story of all these great figures from the Old Testament who showed great faith. Therefore, says the author, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Make every effort to live in peace with everyone, and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterwards, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected, even though he sought the blessing with tears. He could not change what he had done. Long way from here today, in the big city of London, the London Marathon is taking place. Don't think that I'm going to tell you anything about long distance running. That's not my thing. But it is a great illustration of the Christian life. Paul, in fact, seems to have been somebody who had an eye for athletics, because he quite often uses images that are athletics. And here the author of Hebrews picks up something of the same theme, although it's not, I think, Paul that's writing here. But he picks up something of the same theme in the passage. So, Paul, for instance, speaks about keeping your eyes on the prize. That language has been used in a variety of contexts. And the idea is that you focus on Christ Jesus, who has called you heavenwards. Paul talks about forgetting what is behind, pressing on to what lies ahead. Well, we're going to look at something very similar in Hebrews, where the author talks about fixing our eyes on Jesus. And the image he uses in the first few verses is very much the image of an athletics meeting, we might say. Like the marathon today, this is not a sprint, this is an endurance run. It's a long process. Perhaps it's a little bit like one of these 10,000 meter races where it's run in a stadium and there are people all around looking on. There's something of that image here, that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. All these people that were mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. Now they are looking on to encourage, looking on not to cast stones or to cast judgment on us, but rather as an encouragement, as a challenge, as those who can spur us on in the future. So I want us today to think about what it means to fix our eyes on Jesus. You'll see that's in verse 2 there, that's a key element of what we are to do as we're running this race, fixing our eyes on Jesus. And I want to think about why we have to fix our eyes on Jesus, and particularly because there are so many hazards, because the race is hard, and because he is the one that has both accomplished the race for us and who waits at the end for us. He is our only hope of completing this race. So, fix your eyes on Jesus, first of all, because there are so many hazards. Well, there are lots of witnesses, but in the midst of the many witnesses who have been people of faith during the history of God's dealings with humanity, we are responsible for how we run the race. I guess many people who will be running in a race today, or many people who run in athletics meetings, have lots of family members and friends in the crowd cheering them on. These friends and family may have invested lots of time and energy and money in helping the athlete to get there, but in the end, the athlete has to compete in their own right. It is not sufficient that somebody has devoted their life to getting them there. Now it is their responsibility. And so what the author of Hebrews says now is, right now you're on the track, you must run, but watch out because there are lots of hazards. There are all sorts of things that are going to get in your way. Notice that the first call is to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. So perhaps here we have to change our athletics image from the image of the track, although that would work too, as you see people taking off their tracksuits and getting down to their running gear. But also if you imagine a cross-country run, where there are all sorts of perhaps brambles and branches and all kinds of undergrowth that people have to go through, then if they have long sort of catchy socks or baggy trousers or long laces, they're just going to be caught up in all sorts of ways. So the author of Hebrews says, let's get rid of everything that is going to hinder us, is going to catch us, is going to entangle us. There are so many hazards, as we see this as an image of what it means to live as a Christian. There are so many hazards there. And when we ask, well, what are the hazards? Well, the author says, well, everything. Throw off everything that hinders. In a sense, that everything means it can be for one person one thing, for another person another thing. It's not always the same experience. It's not always the same situation, but there are things that can get in our way as living as Christians. So sometimes it will be the things that our minds dwell on. Sometimes it will be the things that we may want to spend time doing. Sometimes it may be people we want to spend time doing things with. Sometimes it may be things we consume that are bad for us. Sometimes it may be the things that we watch, or the things that we ponder, or what we spend our money on, or whatever it might be. There are all kinds of things that in our lives can hinder us being good runners in this race. And so, while we have lots of encouragement, we're also responsible to say, what might it be today that hinders me? What might it be that gets in the way of me being a faithful follower of Jesus? And what might it be that that needs to be got rid of? I need to throw it off. I need to get rid of it in some way or other today. Particularly, that is this word sin, the sin that so easily entangles. So that's obviously caught up in that everything. But you notice that idea of getting caught up, of tripping you up. Sin understood here in that tendency to go our way rather than God's way. That tendency to say, I have a better plan than you have, Lord. I have a determination to go my own way. And now we are human, and we recognize that reality of sin is not one that we can completely eradicate. Not at this time. But it's wise for us to notice that that's part of our human existence, that we are inclined to make self-centered decisions, to make unwise decisions, to make ungodly decisions. That's just where our natural instinct takes us. And so we need to be praying day by day, Lord, protect me from myself, protect me from making those decisions. Keep me from the decisions, the actions, the thoughts, the words that will mess up my witness, that will mess up my ability to live for you. That reality of sin in our lives, for everybody, whether a Christian or not, is vital that we take seriously. We confess our sins together, and we come to the only one who can deal with those sins, as we'll see later on, that he alone, Jesus alone, can give us the way to get that sin as a major entanglement. It can be dealt with by Jesus. So we recognize that. If we are not yet Christians, then we have to particularly recognize it, because we don't by nature see ourselves as sinner. I think that probably most people, if they think of sin, they think of something that somebody else does. Somebody who's got caught out doing something they shouldn't be. Somebody who does something that they get into the newspapers for. And so if they do acknowledge sin in their own lives, it will be to say something like, well, none of us is perfect, which tends to be a means of comparing ourselves to others and saying, well, I'm not nearly as bad as the next person. But the Bible calls us all to recognize the reality of sin in our lives, to recognize that we cannot avoid the fact that we are responsible before God. We cannot avoid the fact that any lack of adherence to God's good purposes, to his good will, any deviation from that, any lack of commitment to that, is an offense to him that deserves judgment. We can only live this life in a useful, meaningful way before God if we deal with this sin. And that is the wonderful story that is told in the rest of this passage, that God does not call us to fix the problem ourselves. Rather, he calls us to look to Jesus to fix that problem in our lives. So when we are to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, it's not saying we can do this independently. It's not saying that we can fix this for ourselves, but it's saying that Jesus is the way in which we fix this in our experience. So we throw off the stuff that's going to get in our way. There's a deliberate decision to say, I'm not taking that with me anymore. Maybe we've been trying to run in big baggy jumpsuits up to now. Well, today is the opportunity to say, I'm getting rid of that. I'm getting rid of everything that would so easily entangle me. And to pray, Lord, help me to do what I cannot do myself. Let this be accomplished by your power in my life. So we have to fix our eyes on Jesus because there are so many hazards, and he is the only one who can help us to deal with those hazards. Secondly, because the race is hard. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Now, I have no idea what it's like to run 20 odd miles, and I don't expect to have any idea of that anytime soon. But those who do that sort of thing never look towards the end like they're having a really happy time. They look like they are pressing through pain, and that seems to be the consistent story. There is great reward, there is great delight in having met that accomplishment, but any kind of process that requires diligence, determination, perseverance, even pushing through pain, that's hard. And that's the image that is given of living as a Christian follower of Jesus, a disciple in this world. It's not an easy life. If you've ever heard, hopefully you haven't, but if you've ever heard, come to Jesus and all your problems will be over, then you've been misled. That's not the way it works. What you can say is come to Jesus, and in your problems, Jesus is there with you. He promises never to leave you or forsake you. But it's a hard calling, and in some respects, becoming a Christian is an even harder route, because then it puts you out of step with much of society around you. We'll find ourselves out of kilter with the general thrust of society. So we have to keep our eyes on Jesus in order that we don't get put off, that we don't get discouraged. There are all these people cheering us on, so to speak, and if anyone comes to be a Christian, what they'll find is that there have been a whole group of people praying for them. There'll be a whole lot of people who are absolutely thrilled that they have come to faith. There may be some others that are really not so happy, and there may be some others who will give opposition, but there are always those who belong to the family of Jesus who will be delighted. But nonetheless, it is from Jesus alone that we get the ultimate encouragement. We've got to fix our eyes on his face, and he helps us to follow the race marked out for us. This idea of a race marked out means we can't just make it up on our own. We have to follow the path that Jesus lays out for us. There's a certain way to be a disciple of Jesus, and it's not up for us to make it our own way. You may have heard of the long-distance runner who, for some reason, decided to use her car for a certain part of the journey. Well, I'm sure that made the whole process more efficient, but it wasn't permitted. That was not allowed as part of the regulation. God calls his people to follow him in a particular way. It will look different for each individual person. They will be in different roles within life. They will perhaps do one job or another job. They will have different personalities and characters. They will engage with different people. But nonetheless, there's a certain commonality about what it means to live as a follower of Jesus. Fundamentally, it means to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. And that, lived out in practical ways, is what we're called to. So if we're not to get distracted from that, if we're not to get caught up in these things that will tangle us up, we have to keep our eyes on Jesus. And so that really sets the scene for the key issue in this passage, which is we keep our eyes on Jesus because of who he is, because of what he has done. So first of all, we keep our eyes on Jesus because he has made the way. So Jesus is not simply like the coach who is standing at the finishing line cheering us on, but he is the one who has enabled us to run the race at all. He has prepared the race. We might say he has created the competition. He has created this route that we can run, and he has made it possible for a human being to run that race, a human being who otherwise would not be capable of doing it. So he's not simply cheering us on from a distance, but he is the one who has created this possibility. He has created it as, using very striking phrases, the pioneer and the perfecter. These terms that we have in English use variations on the Greek words for the beginning and the end. And we find that sort of language used of Jesus elsewhere, and indeed of God. The Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. That sort of language is used in Revelation. This is very similar kind of idea, but it draws together in a slightly different way how significant Jesus is to this race. He's the pioneer in that he goes before. He is the one who has ploughed the way, so to speak. So if you now think about running your race through a field full of high plants, that's going to be hard work. But if somebody has cut through before you, has gone through the undergrowth, has cleared the way, then that's going to be very different. So Jesus is the pioneer. He's also the perfecter. Now, it's not just that he makes the road flat. It's not just that he makes it a nice experience, but he brings it to completion. He is the one who gives us confidence that we can make it to the end, because he has completed the road. So he's the pioneer and perfecter of faith. We talk about having faith. People talk about being people of faith. But what this passage says is that it's not enough just to have faith in something. There's often that sense that we have to have faith, keep the faith. That sort of language is used many times in general society. But the question is, what do you have faith in? Is it someone, something that is reliable and dependable? Jesus is the pioneer and perfecter of faith. He's the one who has made faith meaningful because he is entirely reliable. He has completed the task, and we can trust him, and we can, if we trust him, rely that he is worthy of our trust. Perhaps many people, when they are considering their life as a Christian, or perhaps becoming a Christian, they think, well, can I trust putting my life in Jesus' hands? If you imagine somebody perhaps dangling by a hand from a precarious cliff edge, and there's a rescuer who says, "Take my hand," then the question is, do you trust that person's hand more than you trust your own hand? Your own hand's clinging there to the edge, and it feels like you're just going to drop off, but nonetheless, you're not sure if you trust the other person more. That's the experience that many people will face when they are asked, will you put your life in the hands of Jesus? And the instinct is to say, no, I'm hanging on tight, and I'm going to hang on by my fingernails, and I trust myself more than Jesus. Well, Jesus says, you can trust me. You can see what I've done in the lives of God's people through the ages. You can see what I've done in the lives of other people who are part of the Christian community worldwide. Will you risk letting go of your own attempt to hang on, and rather finding that you are held fast by Jesus? What did this Jesus do? Well, we're told that it was a kind of race that he ran. We are told that he had joy set before him, and because of that joy, he endured the cross. So the image is very similar to what's been there in the early part of the verses. Something glorious at the end, and so you press through what is the current experience. What was that current experience? Well, the current experience was enduring the cross. And that's explained a little bit further in terms of scorning its shame. Now, for those who have been part of a church community, you will have heard many times about the cross. The cross was a terribly brutal form of execution that the Romans devised. Human ingenuity knows no bounds, and sadly it knows no bounds in terms of cruelty and in terms of brutality. And so what we have in the cross is the perfect combination, in inverted commas, of terror, pain, humiliation, and a slow execution. The cross was deliberately designed not to be quick. It was intended to extend the process of humiliation as far as possible. So one of the things that again, we don't tend to read very much about in the Gospels, because everybody who wrote the Gospels or who was around at the time of the Gospels knew all too well what Roman execution was like. But crosses tended to be placed at crossroads, at intersections. The idea was that they were public service announcements, perhaps a little bit like the thing you're going to get in your phone this afternoon. So they were warnings: don't end up like this guy. And so people who were just walking about their business would come across these horror scenes of people being exposed. They were exposed in the sense of exposed to the elements, exposed in the sense of exposed to any wildlife that was around, and they were exposed generally because they were naked, because the Romans weren't worried about whether they would make life comfortable and that people wouldn't be embarrassed. They were trying to cause embarrassment. And so what we find Hebrews talking about here is less about the pain and more about the shame. Because in a sense, that's exactly what the cross was intended to accomplish. People didn't tend on the cross to die of pain. They died of being no longer able to take a breath. They died of asphyxiation as their arms no longer had the ability to raise them. They just couldn't take air into their lungs anymore. So it was long, drawn out, and for all of this time, it is humiliation. Jesus was under no illusions about this. We see that in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew what he was facing. But he endured that because of joy that was set before him. Now, what was that joy? Well, Hebrews doesn't say specifically, but I think we can recreate something of that. Because if the joy was simply to be with his Father, then that was a joy he already had. He didn't have to leave that experience of being with his Father. He would have retained that joy. But what he does is he comes into the experience of humanity, shares that experience, fulfills God's callings for humanity, bears the punishment for the rejection of God that all of humanity has experienced and has shared in. And what that accomplishes is purchasing, is gathering to himself a people who will trust in his work, who will be his, if you like, reward, his trophy that he receives. He will look at people who otherwise would have been lost, who otherwise would have been distanced from God forever, and he will look at them and he will see people that his perseverance brought into God's forgiveness and life and family. And so he was ready to scorn the shame. Yes, he dealt with the pain, but he also was ready to put himself to the lowest place, as Philippians chapter 2 says, so that he could win people like you and me into rescued experience of not just bare rescue by the skin of our teeth, but life in all its fullness, life in the family of God. What an amazing commitment he shows. He grits his teeth, so to speak, and presses through this awful experience in order that we might know peace, forgiveness, life, and hope. And what happens at the end of that is we're told he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. We've heard this phrase often in Hebrews, echoing Psalm 110, this sense of completion, of glory, of authority, of rule, and by pressing through to the end, even where it seemed that everything might have been overwhelmed by the attack of the evil one, the weight of sin, Jesus presses on because he is holding on to the reality that his work will accomplish joy, will accomplish goodness for his people. And so Jesus has run the race. He's made the way. He has accomplished what's had to be done, but he's also shown the way. So not only has he accomplished what is necessary, but he now becomes our model. He enables us to say that's what it looks like to be faithful. It means sometimes pressing through the hard time, but it means that you can have hope of getting to the end. But also, as we consider Jesus, as we fix our eyes on Jesus, we're told in verse 3 to consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. You know, it's not simply so that you can understand the reality of what the cross achieved. That is important. It's so that you can have correct theological knowledge. That's certainly important. But it's so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. There is encouragement. And what we're called to do is ponder Jesus, consider him, reflect on him, think about him. It's one of the benefits of being together in a church service. We have time to just think about what it means that Jesus, the glorious Son of God, gives himself to the fullest extent for the sake of his people. We just let that sink in. We think about the fact that that's not just for people in general, but for me and for my life and for my redemption and for the forgiveness that I receive. And as we ponder that, we are encouraged, we are enabled to take the next step. Maybe some of us are feeling like we can hardly take another step today. As we ponder Jesus, as we think about his actions, we can take another step. But there's another way in which he encourages us, which isn't really described in this passage, but it is described elsewhere. And that is that Jesus doesn't, like a coach, simply stand at the end of the track and cheer us on. It's not simply that he has made the way before us, that he's run that race before us, and now is at the end and cheering us on. But the wider New Testament tells us that Jesus is right there beside us. He's right there with us in the midst of the race. His presence is promised. And that is our great encouragement. When we gather around the Lord's Supper, what we do is we remember that Jesus has promised to be with us. And that as we take the bread and the wine, it is a symbol that Jesus, by his Spirit, is present with us to encourage us. It's a situation we can take when we're very well aware of our weakness. We're very well aware of our stumbling steps. We're very well aware that we in our own strength can't make it to the end. But we are given hope and encouragement because Jesus is with us. So today, fix your eyes on Jesus. Fix your eyes on Jesus because there's much in our lives, including our own sinful nature, that will cause us to trip and to stumble if we don't keep focused on him. Keep your eyes on Jesus when you feel that every muscle is aching and crying out, because it is hard, but that doesn't mean it's not worth running. And keep your eyes on Jesus because he has made the way, he has shown the way, and he is our encouragement on the way. Let's pray. Our Father, enable us as we take time now to reflect on the death of Jesus, to reflect on it in a way that is both humble and contrite and acknowledging of our sin, but also joyful, delighting in what Jesus has accomplished for us by the cross. We pray that it will be a significant moment in our lives, a moment that enables us to press on just a few more steps in your strength. For Jesus' sake.